Please leave a comment where you are watching from and share your horror stories with us. Thank you. When I worked at a naval hospital, I thought I had seen it all. Every so often, something lands in front of you that stays with you for the rest of your life. For me, that something came in the form of a 19-year-old Marine who had what can only be described as the worst injury I've ever seen in my life. First, let me explain something about the culture of artillery Marines to the best of my ability. Artillery units, the guys who operate those massive howitzer guns capable of launching 100-pound rounds over 25 miles, have their own set of traditions and rituals. Some of them are great for morale, building camaraderie and teamwork. But then there are the ones that cross the line into hazing. One of these traditions, as I learned that day, was something called kissing the breech. The breech of an M777 howitzer is the part of the gun that recoils after a round is fired. When you're talking about a weapon that weighs over 9,000 pounds and is designed to launch rounds with enough force to obliterate a target miles away, the recoil is no joke. It's violent and powerful, like the punch of a god. The kissing the breech tradition involved new Marines, or boots, as they're often called, getting as close to the breech as possible during a live fire exercise. It was supposed to be a kind of dare, a rite of passage to prove you weren't scared. And of course, it was incredibly stupid. I'd never heard of this tradition until that day, and honestly, I hope I never hear about it again. From what I understand, it wasn't exactly official or sanctioned by leadership, but it was one of those things that had been passed down informally from Marine to Marine. Usually, the boots would get close to the breech, the round would fire, and they'd walk away a little shaken but unharmed. Except this time, things didn't go that way. The Marine in question, called John, was only 19 years old. He was fresh out of boot camp. From what I heard later, he'd been egged on by his peers to get closer. And then the gun fired. The breech recoiled, and it smacked him directly in the face with the force of a literal cannon. John was transferred to our hospital about a day after the incident. When he arrived, I was part of the team responsible for stabilizing him, and that moment I saw him for the first time will never leave me. To put it bluntly, John no longer had a face. The recoil had obliterated everything: his eyes, his nose, his mouth, his chin. There was nothing left but a gaping, raw wound where his face used to be. His head was wrapped in surgical dressings and tubes were sticking out everywhere, keeping him alive. I remember standing there for a moment, stunned, before snapping myself out of it and getting to work. The hardest part wasn't the injury itself, though. It was the humanity of it all. John wasn't just a patient, he was a kid. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. And those someones were there with him. His family had flown in as soon as they'd heard what happened, and seeing them was almost harder than seeing John himself. His mother was holding on to pictures of him from before the incident, pictures of a handsome, smiling young man who looked like he had his whole life ahead of him. She clutched those photos like they were a lifeline, like if she held them tightly enough, she could will her son back to the way he used to be. It was heartbreaking. As a medical professional, you're trained to focus on the task at hand. You can't let yourself get too emotionally involved, or you'll never make it through the day. But in moments like this, that's easier said than done. I couldn't stop thinking about what John must have been like before the accident. I imagined him joking around with his friends, calling his mom to tell her about his day, dreaming about the future. And now here he was, lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life because of a stupid hazing ritual. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Stabilizing him was no small feat, and it took a team of skilled professionals working together to keep him alive. There were moments when it felt like we were on the brink of losing him, but somehow John hung on. He was a fighter, and despite everything, he refused to give up. I didn't get to follow John's case after those initial hours. That's just the nature of the job. Once your part is done, the patient moves on to the next stage of care. But I've thought about him often over the years. I've wondered what happened to him, whether he made it back home, whether he was able to rebuild some semblance of a life. I hope he did. I hope he's still out there somewhere, surrounded by the love of his family. So I've been a nurse for over 10 years, and I have to be honest, so much of my experiences are not as gory or traumatic as so many others here and never will be. But for me, and I know that some of you might understand, the most fucked up things I see, and will continue to see, is the horror of Alzheimer's, frontal temporal dementia, and Lewy body dementia. I tell you what, these PPL come in, and they are polite and confused, able to fake it sometimes. Maybe their families have cared for them at home for a long time. Within hours, often they realize they aren't leaving, and the family is gone. The facade is over. They become mean and nasty often. Or the traumatic weight loss, the refusing to eat, the empty look in their eyes. Begging to be released from their shell of a body in their own personal hell. Unable to verbalize the pain or confusion or anything they feel. The families going through this is sad too. But what I was reminded of was when some of these folks do get sick or break a hip or poop themselves. The amount of people it often takes to help them and clean them up literally have to try to hold their hands down because they do not understand what's going on no matter what. So yes, imagine 4'10", little old lady who is 90-some years old. In the shower, with 2 or 3 staff because she's swinging and pissed off, but hasn't had a shower in over a week, and starts with diarrhea. One girl gets sick, so old lady grabs the poop and starts smearing it on her, ends up standing on wet floor with other 2 gals in there trying to hold on to her, and keep her off the floor and get her clean, throwing handfuls of poo at the girls, the doorway, and the wall. And here comes Iowa_popcorn, right now knocking on the door in her dress clothes as the assistant director of nursing, trying to help people, and gets poo landed at feet. Another story to add for you here from my co-worker. I was a CNA and had been working at a nursing home for about a month. This nursing home was extremely understaffed all the time. On this particular night, I had 60 patients. Yes, you read that right. 60. The closest nurse was on the next section. Very frequently, I would be the only staff member on the unit. Things were going okay considering everything. At around 4 a.m., I was making my last rounds. I was trying to do my work when a confused woman came up to me insistent that it was 8 a.m. and she would coffee and toast. I couldn't fetch that for her because the kitchen was closed. I tried to convince her to go to bed, but that didn't work. After 20 minutes of this, I heard the voice of a nurse scream for me. I couldn't leave the confused lady, so I put her in a wheelchair and rolled her down to where I can help my nurse and keep an eye on her. The nurse told me she was trying to pass meds when she heard a woman scream. She went running into her room to find one of my patients in a pool of her own blood. This woman was trying to get herself to the bathroom when she slipped. She broke her hip and smacked the back of her head. This woman was my patient, but I couldn't get to her in time. I put on gloves, grabbed a washcloth, and applied pressure to her head. Meanwhile, the nurse put her hip on a pillow and got vitals. Another CNA called 911. I gave report to the paramedics, and they took her to nearest hospital. She came back soon to the nursing home, and she was never the same. I believe she got a traumatic brain injury. I don't think much could be done for her, because she was 98 when this happened. Before, she was mildly confused. When she came back, she would just lie in her bed and scream. After that shift, I told people what happened. The mass amount of blood was hard to miss. I gave report and clocked out. I went out to my car and just cried and cried. To this day, I still haven't cried that hard over a patient. The early morning before, I stayed late after my shift. I works nights. Her and I were talking for about 45 minutes how much we love San Francisco and seafood. She told me about growing up on the coast and about the cute sailor boys. Once I realized management didn't give 2 shits about this happening due to short staffing, I put in my 2 weeks notice but refused to actually work those 2 weeks. I've worked at a hospital for the last 2 years and am hoping to transfer to ICU. One thing I should have mentioned was that bed alarms was recently cut from the budget. Management said they aren't important. They're also a restraint-free facility. Nobody knew she was even out of bed. I just looked on Medicare.gov, and this place has been reported 3 times. Glad I left when I did. Damn. This isn't my story, but one a colleague told me during our training as police officers. To be honest, it stuck with me for a long time. Now before I get into it, let me start by laying out the scenario. This was summer. And not just any summer, the infamous summer of 2018 in Germany. If you were around, you'll remember that it was brutal. Record-breaking heat, relentless sun, and the kind of humidity that made every indoor space feel like a poorly ventilated sauna. Why is this relevant, you ask? Oh, you'll see. My colleague, let's call her Anna, was still in her training phase, just like me. One afternoon, she and her supervising officer got dispatched to a call that sounded, at first, like one of those routine property disputes. A landlord had called in, saying their tenants were complaining about a foul smell coming from one of the flats. Not just a bad smell, an extremely foul smell. And to make things worse, one of the tenants reported maggots crawling through the ceiling. You can already see where this is going, right? Anna and her instructor arrived at the scene, a nondescript apartment building with peeling paint and a quiet, eerie atmosphere that always seems to accompany these kinds of stories. They rang the doorbell to the offending flat, but, predictably, there was no answer. No sounds of movement, no voices, nothing. Just silence, except for the faint buzzing of flies that could already be heard through the door. At this point, protocol dictated that they call a locksmith to gain entry. The locksmith arrived quickly, grumbling about the heat as he hauled his tools up the stairs. He made short work of the lock, and when the door swung open, Anna told me it felt like stepping into a scene from a horror movie. Or maybe hell. Except hell probably smelled better. The smell hit them like a physical force, hot and putrid, the kind of smell that makes your eyes water instantly and churns your stomach before you even have time to register what's happening. And then there were the maggots. The floor, the entire floor, was alive with them, a seething, writhing carpet of tiny white bodies that squirmed and squelched with every step. Anna said it was like walking into a maggot gangbang, which is as vivid a description as you're going to get. At this point, it was clear what they were dealing with, but they still had to confirm it. They began their search of the flat, carefully stepping through the maggot-infested living room and into the small kitchen. The smell only got worse the farther they went, and the buzzing of flies was almost deafening. Finally, they found him, or what was left of him. On the couch in the living room was a person-shaped mass of maggots. At first glance, it was hard to even tell there was a body underneath. The maggots were everywhere, a constantly shifting, pulsating layer that covered every inch of what used to be a human being. Through gaps in the writhing mass, Anna could see torn bits of clothing, the only clue that this had once been a man. His face was completely gone, his eyes, his nose, his mouth, all devoured. Maggots crawled in and out of the empty sockets where his eyes had been, wriggling through his nostrils and into his open mouth. He looked more alive in death than most people do in life, but not in any way you'd want to be. The man had been lying face down on the couch when he died, and when Anna and her instructor went to turn him over, she said the sound it made was something she'll never forget. It was like moving raw meat in egg yolk, she told me, her face pale at the memory. The body had already started to liquefy in the intense summer heat, and the couch beneath him was soaked with fluids that had seeped out over the weeks. The maggots had done their work with horrifying efficiency, reducing him to little more than a hollow shell. Now here's the thing about working as a police officer. No matter how obvious it is that someone is dead, we're not authorized to officially declare death. That's strictly the job of a doctor or paramedic. So despite the fact that this guy was clearly, undeniably deceased, Anna and her instructor had to call in paramedics to make it official. The paramedics arrived, and as soon as they stepped inside, the first one, a young trainee, just like Anna, immediately turned green and threw up. The locksmith, who had stayed behind to make sure the door could be secured afterward, didn't fare much better. He managed to make it out of the flat before vomiting spectacularly in the stairwell. Anna said she came dangerously close to losing it herself, but she managed to hold it together by repeating one simple mantra in her head. It's just a wax figure. It's not real. It's just a wax figure. Somehow, convincing herself that the rotting, maggot-covered body wasn't real helped her compartmentalize, though she admitted that the smell made it almost impossible to believe her own lie. The paramedics, after composing themselves, reluctantly went to work. They confirmed what everyone already knew. The man was dead. According to the letters and newspapers scattered around the flat, he'd been dead for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks in a sealed, unventilated flat during one of the hottest summers on record. It was a recipe for decomposition on a scale most people can't even imagine. Once the death was officially diagnosed, the body had to be moved. This, as you can probably guess, was easier said than done. The man's body was so far gone that it was barely holding together. As they lifted him from the couch to transfer him to the trolley, one of his fingers came off. Anna said she wasn't sure if it was her imagination or not, but she thought she heard a soft pop as it happened. The paramedics didn't say anything, just carefully placed the finger on the trolley with the rest of him. It wasn't the time to be sentimental. By the time the body was finally loaded up and taken away, the flat was in even worse shape than when they'd arrived. The couch was a biohazard, the floor was still crawling with maggots, and the smell was so deeply embedded in the walls and furniture that no amount of cleaning would ever get rid of it. Anna told me she couldn't stop thinking about the man's neighbors, the ones who had been living with that smell and the maggots creeping through their ceilings for weeks. It made her grateful for the small mercies in life, like ventilation and the absence of maggots in one's living space. The whole experience left Anna shaken, but she also said it gave her a new appreciation for her job. As horrifying as it was, she knew she'd helped bring some closure to the man's family. She didn't know much about him, who he was, how he'd ended up alone in that flat, but she hoped that, wherever his family was, they could find some peace knowing he'd been found. She also hoped they never had to know the full extent of what had happened to him. As for the rest of us, Anna's story became one of those cautionary tales we passed around during training, equal parts horrifying and darkly funny. In that way only police work can be. It was a reminder of the things we'd signed up for, the things we might have to face someday. I was a vet assistant for many years. A large dog, I forget what breed, came in after having a pretty serious abdominal surgery because he was licking at his sutures and it had opened pretty significantly. The doctor who did that surgery was an absolute nutter. He was an absolute god in the eyes of his clients, but behind the scenes, we all knew he was just a money-hungry a-hole who loved charming his clients. He gets the client to drop off and tells me to just wrap the dog's belly and stick it in a kennel for now. I knew it was a bad idea, but when I tried arguing, he was having none of it. I'm checking in on this dog pretty frequently, and at one point I walk past and see that the dog was pulling strips of the bandage off. Or so I thought. The dog had chewed through the bandage and was pulling all of his intestines out. Not chewing at them or anything, just methodically pulling everything out bit by bit. It still has me messed up to this day. Everything was corrected properly, and the dog was fine. He definitely never told the client what had happened. Another time we had a cat come in. Owners were completely oblivious and just kept saying that he was sore around his rump. Denied there being any wounds, etc. This was an outdoor cat, and I don't believe they paid much attention to him. I take a peek while I'm getting information and doing an initial assessment. The cat was brought in a cardboard box, and the first thing I had noticed was a small amount of blood on the box and some matting/crusting on his fur. I tell the client that I'm just going to take the cat to the back for a quick SEC to show the doctor. We clip back some of the fur, and there's a massive, open abscess close to the cat's backside. We see a few maggots, no biggie. Pretty common. Then, the doctor takes a rectal temperature, and when he pulls out the thermometer, it's covered in maggots. Turns out the abscess had gone through his hip/backside and into his backside. There were tons of maggots crawling out from his backside. I stomach a lot, but I can't do mass amounts of maggots. You could literally hear them. I tapped the F out. Another story for you to enjoy from my family member. When I was studying to be a RN, and I was on placement, I had a lovely old man in his 70s that was DNR. He was awesome, super nice and chatty, but his heart and lungs were failing him, so he was on palliative care. Anyway, as usual, I am doing the rounds and checking people's vitals, and I walk in and do his BP and other vitals, and he tells me his neck is sore, and if he could have a pillow. So I go off to grab him a pillow and come back 5 minutes later and walk in, and I am totally shocked to see on the poor man's neck a golf ball-sized round lump that literally appeared in the 5 minutes I went off to go grab the pillow. I hit the emergency button or MET button, which summons all available staff and the MET team with a crash cart. As soon as I saw the lump on his neck, and one of the senior RNs comes running in, and I immediately explain what's going on, which I didn't have to do much of because it was so obvious walking in. And soon in comes the others nurses with a crash cart. We start to evaluate the lump, take notes of size, color, pain, temperature, etc. So myself and the senior RN go to palpate the lump, and it's super hot, and you can feel a very strong pulse in it. So we're thinking maybe it's an infected lymph node or something. So we go to actually feel the hardness of the lump, and it popped with an extremely loud pop, like water balloon loud pop, and the patient's neck immediately goes purple, and he passes out and goes into a fit right in front of us and only seconds later dies. Turns out what the lump was actually a carotid artery embolization, and upon palpation it burst, and my lovely old man of a patient bleed to death pretty quickly. This one always sticks with me because he was so friendly and I really liked him, and it was so sudden he was literally fine and making jokes with me 10 minutes before he died. However, I also believe this was probably one of the nicest way to go for him, and it would have been super quick and relatively painless compared to his lungs slowly giving out like they were going to. Working in a trauma unit is not for the faint of heart. People think they understand what it's like. Maybe they've seen a few episodes of ER or Grey's Anatomy and think they get the gist. But the truth is, nothing can prepare you for the reality. The smells, the sounds, the sheer chaos of trying to save someone's life while the odds are stacked impossibly against you. It's a kind of intensity most people never experience. I was a respiratory therapist, and I worked in a trauma unit for a good part of my career. It was rewarding in its own strange way, but it also left me with scars, some that are visible, but most that aren't. I still carry those memories with me, even though I've moved on to a non-trauma hospital. They're like ghosts haunting the back of my mind, ready to resurface when I least expect it. I try not to dwell on them, but some stories just won't let go. The first one that comes to mind is a case that was equal parts tragic and surreal. A man came into the trauma bay after being shot in the head. But here's the part that sticks with me: he wasn't alone. He had driven himself to the hospital, carrying his girlfriend in his arms. She had been shot through the neck, a clean through-and-through wound. When he brought her into the trauma bay, she was already gone. There was nothing we could do for her. The man, though, he was still alive. I remember looking at him, covered in blood, holding on to her like he thought we could bring her back. His car, parked just outside, was a scene straight out of a horror movie. It looked like something you'd see in Dexter, blood everywhere, a chaotic, visceral reminder of the violence they'd endured. He survived, but she didn't. I never learned much more about the case. She came in as a Jane Doe, and there wasn't much information to go on. The details blurred into the chaos of the job, but the image of him carrying her into the hospital, desperate and broken, stayed with me. There's something about the human will to survive, to fight for the people we love, even when all hope is lost. It's beautiful in a way, but also devastating. Then there's the one that I think about the most. The one that, if I'm being honest, probably left me with PTSD. We called it a gangland execution. That's what it felt like, at least. A man came into the trauma bay, shot so many times that we couldn't even keep track of the number of wounds. From the belly down, his body was riddled with holes, buckshot, rifle rounds, pistol rounds. Whoever did this to him wasn't just trying to kill him. They were trying to erase him. I'll never forget what his body looked like. There were fist-sized holes in his abdomen and legs, massive wounds that exposed muscle and bone. One of his kidneys was hanging out, and there were pieces of his intestines visible through the carnage. It was the kind of injury where, if you saw it in a movie, you'd think it was over the top. Too unrealistic. Except it wasn't. And here's the thing, he was still conscious. Despite everything, he was awake and talking. He kept asking us, "Am I going to live? Can you take me home?" It broke my heart. How do you even begin to answer a question like that when someone's body is falling apart in front of you? We worked on him as hard as we could, trying to stabilize him, trying to give him a chance. And somehow, against all odds, he survived the initial surgery. But that was just the beginning of what would turn out to be a slow, agonizing death. Over the next several weeks, his body started to shut down. His bowels became necrotic, and he couldn't absorb nutrients anymore. His kidney, and what little remained of his liver, couldn't keep up. One of the surgeons described his digestive tract as a straight shot from his mouth to his rectum. There was nothing left to process food, no way for his body to heal itself. To make matters worse, his condition kept forcing us to make impossible choices. His limbs became so infected and necrotic that we had to amputate them, one by one. By the end, he was reduced to little more than a stump, breathing through a hole in his throat. I like to imagine that he wasn't conscious for the final days of his life, but honestly, I can't remember. I think I blocked out most of that part, because it was too much to handle. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of him asking us to take him home. There was so much pain in his voice, but also hope. Hope that we could somehow fix what had happened to him. Hope that he could go back to his life, even though we all knew that wasn't possible. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, no matter how hard you try to move on. Then there was the man who came in after being shot on the interstate. It was a random act of violence. A driver stopped, got out of his car, and shot him in the head. Somehow, the victim made it to the hospital and survived the initial surgery, but he was declared brain dead shortly afterward. For the next 3 days, he was kept alive on machines, and I was one of the people responsible for his care. I'll never forget those 3 days. Every time I went in to check on him, I had to wipe brain matter off his forehead. It was a grim, repetitive task, made worse by the doctor's dark sense of humor. "Wiping up IQ points," he'd say, as if that made it easier to deal with. I get it. Sometimes you have to laugh to keep from breaking down. But it didn't make it any less surreal. Eventually, his family made the decision to take him off life support. I was there for that, too. I've been there for a lot of moments like that. Families saying their goodbyes, letting go of someone they love. It never gets easier. There are so many more cases I could talk about, but honestly, I don't know if I have the strength to go into all of them. There was my friend who got run over by a semi and ended up in my care. There was the man who blew off his lower jaw in an attempt on his life, leaving behind a mess of shattered bone and exposed tissue. There was the man who tried to hang himself with a razor-lined noose, cutting himself to ribbons in the process. There were the countless partial limb amputations, the people who came in broken and bleeding and didn't make it out. I think about those cases more often than I'd like to admit. They creep into my mind when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm driving, when I'm doing something completely unrelated. Sometimes it feels like they're burned into my brain, these vivid snapshots of pain and loss and violence. When the trauma unit closed, I transferred to a non-trauma hospital. It was a relief in some ways. I didn't have to deal with the constant barrage of life and death situations anymore. But I also missed it. As much as it took out of me, working in the trauma unit felt like I was serving a community that really needed it. Every day, I got to be part of a team that fought to save lives, even when the odds were impossible. And even though we didn't always win, it felt good to try. I've seen a lot of messed up things. A few stick out, but nothing like the diesel truck container left in the El Centro desert filled with people in August. I've talked about that one enough here, and that one messed me up so badly that I still have issues to this day from it. 36 people were left in a container in August in a place that averages 110+ degree heat. Only 4 were alive when I went out, and it was a lesson in what heat stroke does to a body. There was poo, pee, and blood all over the inside of that trailer, and the people had gouged scratch marks in the metal with their nails trying to get out. Some of the people had tried to tear open their necks with their own hands. Some had ripped chunks off their face and eyes. Women and children had been attacked and brutalized, etc. You could smell it coming in from a quarter of a mile away. Had a patient whose wife tried to kill him by turning on the cement truck while he was in it and cleaning it. Imagine being in a giant washing machine with blades and being bounced around in it. Yeah, he was beyond messed up and don't really understand how he lived. I was there when they brought his wife in and sat her down in front of him, and they put the pen in his mouth so he could sign the divorce paperwork in front of her. It was like he was saying, "I am still here and your ass is going to prison for a very long time." Had a Marine who came in that had been ran over by a tank. We did some real experimental shit on him, using hyperventilation therapy and such. He lived and was talking when we finally shipped him off to the Naval Hospital a few months later. As a student, there was this guy who came in comatose that ended up waking up and attacked the patient next to him and bit his D off through the Foley catheter twice. Then the guy took on 10 cops and won the first round, seriously injuring quite a few, and then the second wave came through, tackled the guy with a blanket, and nurse dosed him. ICU room was all kinds of messed up after that. Blood everywhere. The old man whose D got bit off died a few days later. The guy who bit off the D managed to get a hold of a razor and attacked himself in the holding cell in the jail ward at the hospital. Last really messed up thing was this baby girl who couldn't have been much more than 3 or 4 who had been attacked, etc. by this entire family over months. It was in Southern California. This poor little girl was so brutalized that she would never be normal again. It was the parents, aunts, uncles, and grandparents all living in this house doing all this sick, depraved stuff to this girl. Last really messed up thing I saw was a 15-year-old girl who had around 12 gunshot wounds from her uncle. I guess her uncle took it pretty badly when she told her parents that he was attacking her and decided to try and kill her. Most F-up personal thing that really got me sobbing though, this woman's boyfriend shot 2 of her kids while she was in the shower, so she comes down to see what is going on, and he has the 10-year-old in a headlock with the weapon next to him. He throws the 10-year-old down and shoots her in the chest. The mom went to run up the stairs, and he shot her, hitting her in the hip. He then called 911, handed the phone to her, and shot himself. So, all this shit comes in, and it seems we may have stabilized everyone, and I have the 10-year-old in ICU, and her blood pressure starts dropping, and the heart rate is climbing. So, the trauma surgeon comes in and opens her up right there, and blood comes out of her cavity onto the floor and around us. The surgeon, he is meticulous and focused trying to figure out where the bleed was, and then he stopped, looked at the monitor, laid his tools down, and said, "Call it at," and walked away. That was a very hard day, and was the first day I walked outside, sat on the curb, and cried. Disclaimer: I'm not a nurse or police officer, but I worked in a rehabilitation/respite center for nearly 5 years. Back a few years ago, I was in my first year as a rehab counselor at a respite center. As you can imagine, we dealt with all walks of life, between sweet old ladies to some people who looked like death reincarnate thanks to drug abuse. Anyway, this one instance was the latter of the two examples. So after about a year of working as a rehab counselor, I thought I saw it all, man. I was so beyond wrong. Almost naive in a way. Being as though I worked graveyard shifts, I'd deal with patients or clients at their worst. Drugs, lack of sleep, graveyard shift, you get this gist. You never knew what you would walk into. I came to work that night expecting hell in a handbasket. Fortunately, I had a pretty chill night, so I expected a chill shift all around. Again, I was naive. My shift ended at 8 a.m., so come 7 a.m., just when I was about to drink some coffee, we get a call from the local police department. We worked with various different agencies, as the homeless population in my town is pretty terrible. Anyway, they call, sounding like they are in a massive hurry to get off the phone. They were asking if we had a bed. Fortunately, or in this case I'd like to say unfortunately, we did. 20 minutes went by, had a quick cup of coffee, had a cigarette, and was on to make my second cup. Figured since I had a chill shift, I'd get caffeinated before getting home to slay some demons as Doomslayer. So as my cup brews, the cops show up, panting like they ran a marathon. As policy would have it, there is a stack of paperwork, both the person being admitted and the person who brought them, and had to fill. The cop absolutely refused to stay. No reason given, stated he will have his boss stop by to fill out any paperwork later on. Said he had to go and detail the car. That should have been the second red flag. Out the car comes this lady, about early to mid-50s, and she's having a hard time walking, not uncommon. The cop says nothing as I see him burst out the front door and lowers his windows and guns it. Okay, I thought. The F. This lady dragging herself finally gets through the door. And then it happens, I get hit with the most absolute foul-smelling stench I've ever smelled. I've smelled a lot of poo and pee working there, so I've gotten more or less used to it. But this was something else, man. You know when Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs did septic tank repairs, or when he would get covered in the city's sewage while underground? Yeah, imagine that smell and multiply it by 3.14. I can hardly breath, trying to contain myself and get through this admit process. During this time, my female colleague begins opening all windows and doors in this place and turns on the AC. Yeah, the AC. You should know never to do that when there is an odor. I'll get back to this. During the process, I learned this woman was a heavy meth addict who also turned tricks to get her daily fix. She also told me that she's got nothing but the cloths on my back since I've been on the streets, 7 years at the time. It became evident that she had consistently urinated and defecated in her pants, and never did a thing about it. Never washed her cloths, never cleaned herself up, or anything of that sort. Fortunately, our policy states the first thing after filling out paperwork is that you must take a thorough shower. Just reminding you here, this is a 45-minute intake process if done quickly. So I'm fucking dying at this point. Eyes are watery, my knees are weak, close to vomiting on my sweater, my cheap spaghetti. Paperwork wraps up, and my female colleague decides to be extra nice by helping her get into the shower and getting her all her essentials and some donated clothing. We threw her clothing away in the industrial trash can outside immediately. I would have burned it, but wasn't something I could do. After about 10 minutes, my colleague comes out, her shirt over her mouth and nose, hyperventilating, trying to explain to me what she just experienced. But instead I had her go outside, get some air and calm down. Day shift arrived and had me stay to explain everything, and my colleague brings me my cup of coffee, and as I'm explaining all this outside, I take a sip and my coffee was literally rancid. I spat it out all over day shift, half apologetically. Even my coffee was tainted. I don't drink. Hardly if ever. I'll have a beer on occasion, but my ass went to 7-Eleven, got a couple bottles of Old English. Yeah, I know it's not beer, and downed them when I got home and passed out. I called out for the entire week and contemplated quitting my job. Looking back at it now, I laugh about it, and I realize not many ordinary people get to have an experience like this.